Hello, my name's Jan Wood. Welcome to today's episode of Coffee Break. And today I'm here in East Balmain. And I'm very fortunate today because I actually have a cameraman. So Bowen Pearce has volunteered to be my cameraman, and I'm taking him on a tour of what it was like when I grew up in the 50s and 60s. So Bowen, thanks for helping me out today. Now the interesting thing is that you're a Balmain boy too, and we actually only have 40 years in age difference. So the Balmain that you grew up in is a totally different place to how it was when I was a child. This place is called the Zig Zag, and it was part of the Adelaide Steamship Company, and the Adelaide Steamship Company owned the land all along the waterfront here. So on my 50th birthday, I bought a cup of coffee and I came and sat here at the Zig Zag. It was very much a part of my childhood. We spent a lot of time here playing with scooters and billy carts. So I'm sitting here drinking my coffee and remembering what it was like all those years ago, being a little girl. And I look up and I see this tree. This huge tree, and I had to sit down again because when I was a little girl this tree wasn't there, and I thought, I'm older than this tree. Now it's not just Balmain that's changed, the whole world has changed, and there's been a huge revolution in the way that people think and behave and lifestyle. It's huge. So lately I've been causing a lot of arguments because I say to people, I'm an old lady, and they go, oh no you're not, no you're not, no you're not, and I go, yes I am, and they go, no you're not, and I go, yes I am. And the reason I am an old lady is because a couple of weeks ago I was asked 3 times if I had a seniors card. And it took me a little bit of headspace to get my head around this one, and I thought, isn't that interesting? The way I perceive myself is no longer my public persona. And admittedly these people were early in their 20s, but just the same it made me put my thinking cap on. Now I'm also going to my 40th high school reunion in about a week's time. So and I'm also a grandmother, so if you're pushing 60, you're going to your 40th high school reunion, you have grandchildren, you have to adjust the way that you're thinking. And I'm quite happy to be called old because I realise what a privileged an amazing life I've led and all the things that I've seen. I saw Neil Armstrong walk on the moon 40 years ago. I saw the Vietnam War. I saw the mass immunisation of children after the Second World War. I've seen so many things and I can tell so many stories. And I'm not dead yet. Now, one of the most significant events, I think, in the 20th century was the women's liberation movement. And concurrent with the wave of feminism of the 1970s was the environmental movement as well. And I've recently been involved in an oral history project with Leichhardt Council. Rosalind Birch had a grant to go around and document oral histories of people who grew up in Balmain and Rozelle and Leichhardt and Annandale and talk about the greening and what happened. Now in 1970, if you were called a greenie, it was considered an insult. You were a Balmain basket weaver. And Balmain actually had a lot of very socially aware people. So it had a lot of greenies and it had a lot of basket weavers. I remember when I was a little girl there were 2 trees when you were stopped at Robert Street, Rozelle, on Victoria Road. There were 2 trees. There was 1 tree in the house where I was living, a really old camphor laurel, and my brother also had a tree in his garden. But apart from that, it was absolutely bare of trees, bereft of trees. And the thing is, a lot of the trees that we have here now are huge, absolutely huge. And the point I want to make here is that I'm older than all those trees. So, with the luxury of a cameraman, I'm going to take you on a trip down memory lane with Jan. Here is a photo of one of my paintings, also in the Patchwork of Memory series. And it's the corner of Troughton Street and Mort Street in Balmain. And it's a memory, so it's not historically accurate. The pub was called the Forth and Clyde, and it was a very, very popular drinking hole for the locals, as well as a lot of the art set. Now, while the Forth and Clyde was operational, so was Mort's Dock. So I've taken a bit of artistic license. It might have been about 1979, or it could have been 1980, that the container terminal that had been on this site was closed down and it moved to Port Botany. So where the Mort Bay Park is now was open space, disused industrial land, and all the local children had a wonderful freedom because they knew where the holes in the fence were and played in there. And in the background there is another superimposure of the historic land use, in that this was where the Princess of Tasmania used to birth when it came to Sydney. This is a painting I painted in about 1990, and it's my memory of Thames Street Wharf. Now, I used to play on Thames Street Wharf when I was a little girl, and there was a kind of house, or it might have been a kiosk, but it was built over the water and it jutted out alongside the wharf. And going onto the wharf we have our lady bowler and our old-fashioned telephone box. The Nicholson Brothers ferries just coming in, and again in the background you can see the Princess of Tasmania. A strong memory from my childhood is my corner shop. Now, when I was a little girl there weren't any supermarkets, and people bought a lot of their household needs from the corner shop. So when I was a little girl, if you found a lemonade bottle, it was the most wonderful thing, because you could take it to the corner shop and get 2p for the bottle. And with the 2p you could buy lollies. Now 2p bought quite a few lollies actually, and they were big. Lollies seem to have shrunk over the years. A wagon wheel used to be huge. Or maybe it's just my adult perception has altered the dimensions of things. But here we have the bus going down towards Darling Street Wharf. So this is a photo of my painting, and it's a painting from Birch Grove Oval looking across Grove Street. And I think the corner shop here may have been Gooley's Corner, but I'm not too sure. But the corner shop played a very important part in community life. And again, on the balconies I've got lots of things depicting the 50s and the 60s, like the cloth nappies and the blue singleted worker, because Balmain in those days was very much a working class area, and the uniform was a navy singlet and the navy blue shorts. So he's up there after work having a drink of beer. Here's a photo of another one of my paintings from a patchwork of memories growing up in Balmain in the 50s and the 60s, and it's taken from just below the roundabout at Gladstone Park. There were very few trees in Balmain in the 50s and the 60s. The green area that you can see was sort of overrun with brambles and weeds, and it was this circular piece here featured is repeated here in the magnifying glass, and it's me and my friend as little girls, and we used to love to dress up as cowgirls, and our favourite show on TV was Dale Evans, and we used to pretend to ride our horses everywhere. Now, children had a lot of freedom in those days. It was before the Beaumont children. There were 3 of them. They went missing from a beach in Adelaide, and parents suddenly became very much more concerned about their children's whereabouts. But when I was a little girl, we were really very free, and we just roamed the neighbourhood. We knew where all the holes in the fences were. We knew that we weren't allowed to go in there, but we really did have a lot of freedom. And we did a lot of dangerous things as well. And you'll notice in this photograph that there was very few cars. Very few people owned a car. And the pink building, down here we've got Balmain Bowling Club, and on the other side there was a big building called Dixon Primer. And so all that land that belonged to Dixon Primer is now townhouses. Here's another photograph of one of my paintings. It's not a very good photograph, but it's of Darling Street Wharf in the mid-60s. And there's my friend Sandra in the school uniform standing on the wharf. Now, quite often when we came home from school on the ferry, there would be a film crew on Darling Street Wharf because they made a television series called Magooly, and it was set in Balmain. Now, looking up the hill we have Darling Street, and again you can see how very, very few cars there were. Now, I'm not maintaining that these are historic documents because they're all painted from my memory. Here's another photograph of one of my paintings, and this one is the Balmain Hoyts. Now, the Balmain Hoyts used to be opposite Balmain Post Office on the corner of Darling Street and Roundtree Street. And when I was a very little girl, I think I must have been 7, my father took me to see Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. And I was very, very frightened. So if you have a look in this painting, there are lots of birds, and you can see how the queue to go into the theatre stretches around the corner. And again, it's not a historic document, but it's a memory from my childhood. And over here, there's a little bit of the painting missing, but it says "Coming Soon, Psycho." And here I've painted a shower curtain with a knife. And along here, if you look closely, you can see some very friendly looking birds. The bottom right hand corner is my memories of what it was like inside the theatre. The ushers dressed up. They wore suits and bow ties, and the cashier was in a little booth, and there was the shop in the lobby where you could buy popcorn and cordial. The Birds, the movie, starred the actress Tippi Hedren. This is a photograph of another of my paintings, and it's not a very good photograph, but it does contain a lot of my memories of the late 70s and the early 80s. Now, when we first moved here, Mort Bay was a container terminal, so these little boxes are the containers that were stacked up on the wharf. Now, Mort Bay Park was the container terminal, and the big container ships would moor down next to Thames Street Wharf,
and the containers would be unloaded, and then they were loaded onto trucks, and the container trucks would take the containers up Maud Street. And it was a very dangerous thing. They were so big, the streets were so narrow, and Maud Street, and down here we have the Painters and Dockers Hall. Quite a few infamous stories from there. Here we have the Dry Dock Hotel. And because Balmain was such an industrial area, the pubs did a roaring trade. And I think Balmain has probably the most pubs out of any suburb in Australia. So again, it's not a strictly historic document. It's all from my memories. Here's Arnold in his little guard shed. And I've depicted the little workmen's houses. And again, it's got the Sydney Harbour Bridge in it. Over here we have the Caltex tanks. Now, if you've been following the Coffee Break show, you'll know that the Caltex site is now a wonderful national park, Ballast Point Park. And the design of it evokes the industrial history and the presence of the tanks. So this photograph of a painting depicts life in Balmain in about 1970. So you see the double-decker bus coming up Darling Street and the schoolgirls in the foreground.